Today we remember Lucy Graley, a writer who died in December. She was 39 years old. The New York Times reported in her obituary that no cause of death was announced. Friends said she'd been despondent over operations she underwent 2 years ago. Graley was the author of the 1994 memoir Autobiography of a Face, about her experience growing up with extreme facial disfigurement. One critic wrote of the book, "So many memoirs make you feel that you've been sealed up inside a wall with a monomaniac. A really good one, like Autobiography of a Face, makes you feel there's more to ask and learn. You're not just seeing the writer. You're not trying to see yourself. You're seeing the world in a different way." Many of us are dissatisfied when we look in the mirror, but that's very different from the extreme anguish Lucy Graley experienced when she saw her reflection. By most standards, her face was ugly, even repulsive. Graley had cancer in her jaw as a child, for which she underwent 5 years of treatment. The surgery and other therapy left her disfigured. Over her lifetime, she had more than 30 reconstructive operations. In her memoir, she wrote that the pain from feeling ugly made cancer seem minor in comparison. Terry spoke with Lucy Graley in 1994, after the publication of her autobiography. They began with a reading. In this passage, Graley is a sophomore in college, a year in which she was recuperating from an 8-hour-long reconstructive operation.
While I was in the hospital, I had been so ill that I hadn't put much effort into thinking about my appearance. My mother had been given the use of an apartment on the Upper East Side for the summer, and afterward I went to stay with her. One whole living room wall was covered with mirrors. I walked into the apartment and almost fainted at the sight of me. The graft had been applied not to just one side of my face, but from one ear to the next, and was obscenely swollen to the size of a football. A very large piece of pale skin from my hip had been left in, not just a small patch like the last time. This strip was 1 foot long and 4 inches wide, and on either side of it were long rows of sutures. If feeling like a freak had been more in my mind than in my face at other times in my life, the visage I saw now staring back at me was undeniably repulsive. The feeling was confirmed for me whenever I went out on the street. People would stop in their tracks and stare at me. One afternoon a beggar ran up behind me, demanding money. I stopped and turned around to look at him. He stopped in mid-sentence, looked at me for a minute longer, then politely apologized and handed me a $1 bill before turning away, muttering to himself. My self-esteem reached the bottom of the deepest, darkest pit.
Lucy, I'd like you to describe what your face looks like now.
It's funny you say that, and my immediate reaction is to sort of give you my opinion of my face rather than my actual face. Like I could say, well, it's a nice face, or it's a this face. I mean, if I were to be strictly clinical about it, most of the upper half of my face is quite normal. I have a slight swelling on my left eyelid from a lot of surgery, which has blocked the lymph drainage, but it's not very noticeable. I have slightly, they're not buck teeth, but you can see my teeth in a way that you wouldn't necessarily if it weren't for the fact that my lower lip is a little bit collapsed on the left side. There's a patch of white skin on the right side of my face, which is covering a small defect in the bone, where 2 different bone grafts on either side of my face join up, and they join up slightly imperfectly. So there's a slight lopsidedness to my lower jaw. There's something distinctly odd about it. If you were to see me, you would definitely know that something had happened to me. Then we start getting into the more subjective accounts of what my face looks like. There would be many times in my life when I would just have simply answered that question by saying, I'm ugly. Now I'm willing to concede that my face is actually quite interesting, and not only interesting, but I think there are aspects of it which I find quite attractive. And that sounds like some kind of result of a lifelong self-help program, but it isn't. It's more to do with finally, at the age of 31, conceding that there is no one specific face to which I should be aspiring. I think my relationship to my face changes a lot, although perhaps not quite as much as it was when I was younger. In my book, I say at one point that I was unable to distinguish between saying I'm depressed and I'm ugly, because the two had become completely linked in my mind. I really did not know the difference. And I'm really just like anybody else. I have days where I wake up and I think, oh God. And then other days I look in the mirror and I think, hey, I don't look so bad.
Your cancer was diagnosed when you were in 4th grade.
Yes.
And you missed most of 4th grade and 5th grade between surgery and chemotherapy and then radiation. And you write during that period you really felt most comfortable when you were in the hospital.
I loved the hospital.
Why did you love it there?
I felt I think we just love the familiar, even when the familiar is objectively unpleasant or even horrible. I'm a very independent person, and I liked my independence at the hospital. I didn't feel like I had to answer to anybody. And a lot of my suffering was emotional suffering. I mean, there was a definite physical side to it. There was a large physical side to it. But I saw that as rather easy and compared to the sort of emotional assaults of guilt and shame that I was continuously throwing upon myself. And I never felt the need to do that in the hospital. It was like a refuge.
What did your face look like then?
Oh, it changed weekly, practically, which is part of the really the story and the dilemma. It's not really so much, my story is not so much a story about being disfigured. It's really about having a face that changed so continuously that I never really identified myself as connected to it. And the easiest moments in my life have been, or rather the most damaging moments in my life have been that easy fall into saying, I'm ugly, just like defining it and closing the door on it that way, rather than looking at the fact that my face was different almost continuously, and that I actually I put off developing that sort of social sense that most people have to come to terms with. On the other hand, I always was able to feel special. I never had that familiar adolescent worry of fading into the crowd. I was special, and I tried to use that to my advantage, and I tried to use it as a power almost over other people.
I found it interesting when you were young and your chemotherapy treatments were ending. This must have been still in grade school. You were almost afraid of them ending because you wouldn't be special anymore.
I think, too, that has to do with the familiar, like the love of the familiar. It was what I knew, and it also, I was very intent on trying to be brave all the time. Like, I really wanted to be brave so that my family would recognize my lovability, because I was always worried that, that they didn't love me, and that they would only love me if I could somehow personally take on this task and prove my worthiness. And I was afraid that if I were having chemotherapy, then there would be no place in which I could distinguish myself in that way.
What has your relationship with mirrors been over the years? Have there been periods when you've looked and periods when you didn't want to look, periods when you liked to have mirrors around and periods when you avoided them?
It's really alternated. There have been a lot of times when I've been fascinated by my image, and I'll just stare at it sort of endlessly. And both... we all have those mirror faces that we see each other adopting when we stand in front of the mirror, look in front of the mirror. And I would do that a lot throughout different periods of my life. There was a time when I spent almost an entire year not looking in a mirror, which was very difficult. It really was not very easy to do, to avoid my image. I had no idea how many times you see your own reflected image. I mean, it really is very constant once you become aware of it. It's almost like when you're dieting, that you become aware of how many people are eating around you. And I suddenly became aware of, like, how many reflective surfaces there were. And I stopped looking because I was having something called a tissue expander, which is this very bizarre process where they put a balloon under your cheek and very slowly inflate it with a saline solution over a period of several months so as to stretch out the skin, so that then when they remove it, they'll have skin to cover whatever bone or muscle graft they were going to put in. So I was having one of those, and I was walking around looking like I had a balloon under my face. It was very bizarre. I mean, it got so absurd that I started to feel like I was in some strange kind of myth or story or something. And it just sort of went on. I couldn't bring myself to look. Even after the tissue expander had been taken out, I couldn't bring myself to look. So I just didn't. And even after, that problem was solved, I kept not looking and I kept not looking. And it actually led to one of the greatest revelations in my life, is because I was sitting with somebody a long time later, like a year after not doing this, and it suddenly occurred to me, I was with this man that I was actually attracted to, and I wondered what I looked like to him. And I realized that I really had absolutely no idea of what I looked like, because I had not looked in a mirror for so long. And I realized that it was an almost prehistoric state, because there is almost nobody in the world who does not know what they look like. It just doesn't happen. And I realized that most of the time when I'm with somebody, I'm looking at myself for them. I have this idea of what I look like.
Right.
And I hand it over to them, and then I look only for the negative ways in which they would sort of reflect it back at me. And that was the very first time in my life that I literally had no image of what I looked like to hand over to somebody. I really just had no idea what he saw when he saw me.
Do you remember the first time at the end of that year when you did look in a mirror?
I did it sort of surreptitiously. I didn't march on up to a mirror. I kind of looked. At that moment, I looked into the window behind him, because it was in Scotland, and at Scotland it gets dark at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So it was already dark. So I looked back and I could see the whole cafe that we were sitting in, sort of sitting behind me, and I could see the back of his head, and I could see my hair, and I just sort of dazed my eyes. So I kind of saw my head, or the shape of my head and my hair, without actually looking at my face, and I gradually let it sort of sink in. I let my eyes focus and rest on my own face, and I was actually, I wouldn't say I was pleasantly surprised, but it was me. It was really like the first time that I thought, oh, that's me. How interesting.
I found it interesting you described how sometimes you'd be walking down the street and, a guy would whistle at you. He'd see you from behind.
Mm-hmm.
And, you're thin and you had long hair, and he'd whistle, and then you'd turn around and he'd see your face, and what would happen?
Well, usually it would depend. If he was by himself, it would just get quiet. If they were a group of people, or men, because it was always men, it would... sometimes they would say things to each other, like nasty things, like, oh, go ask her on a date, in this very sort of teasing way. That was very damaging, because ultimately that was about sex and about sexuality. That wasn't just making fun of the way I looked. It's one thing to be called, I don't know, there are many disparaging terms that we call each other, relate either in men to any kind of power or potency. That's what if you want to get a man, you say something about him being a wimp or something like that. With a woman, you often refer to her sexuality, whether you call her, some term for a prostitute or some term as for somebody who's undesirable, like ugly. I was called ugly a lot, and that was a direct assault on my sexuality, or my lack of it, as it was perceived.
Yeah, well, the face is a sexual organ, in the sense that that's where you kiss,
mm-hmm.
and you use the mouth to make love. So your disfigurement was very connected to probably how people saw you sexually.
I think so. Yeah, it definitely was.
And to how you saw yourself sexually.
Yeah, I was a late bloomer, as I say. I was convinced I would be a virgin for my entire life. I just sort of gave myself over to it in this martyr kind of way.
You write your only solution to dealing with your face was to stop caring, so you became pretentious.
I was very pretentious. Some people would say I still was, but I won't go into that.
So what was your brand of pretension?
Oh, I was going to be the noble seeker of truth and beauty. And I thought that if I was never going to get, love with a lowercase l, or be beautiful with a lowercase b, then I was going to find out about beauty with a capital B, through art and life and nature, and find out about love as, some sort of, I think I was on some kind of a spiritual quest for a long time. I still am, but in those days, it started out as a protective mode, gradually, luckily, miraculously, it became more, it left the realm of mere sort of defense, and it became a genuine journey, but it was spawned out of just fear of the world. I wasn't rejecting the world because I disdained it. I was rejecting the world because I feared that it would reject me.
You went to out-of-town college. I assume you were still feeling very uncomfortable sexually then, too. And you're right, you had a close friend who was gay, and he started taking you to the gay clubs, which must have been a very interesting experience for you because the gay clubs were very much about sexuality, but it wasn't a sexuality you were part of.
Yeah, it had really nothing to do with me, but I was so closely aligned with it. And I think even at the time, I didn't realize that this was how I was exploring the issue without any danger to me whatsoever. You know, I didn't even recognize that. I never would have associated myself with any kind of, like, you know, mere seeking of earthly pleasures as it was. And it was really only recently when I was at another gay club, I went to a gay club someplace, you know, and there were like just all these like half-naked men gyrating around me. And I thought, you know, Lucy, you twit, like how could you not think that that had anything to do with sex back then? You know, when it had a lot to do with sex, just not necessarily my own.
Do you think writing is at all connected to becoming very inward during the years that you were so self-conscious?
I think I would have been a writer or some kind of an artist, probably a writer anyway. I think what being sick did was it afforded me with two very interesting things. One was the opportunity to lie very still and think a lot. Even when one is, you know, sort of imprisoned by other physical means, one still reads or watches TV or whatever, or is distracted. And there were a lot of times when I couldn't read or watch television even because I really just felt so ill. So I had a lot of time to lie around and think. And I think that was very valuable. What I also had was this disease, as we were talking about in the very beginning, that was not just physical, but was very much emotional. And I suffered a lot physically, and I would go through all kinds of different ways of thinking and ways of viewing the world and this and that, all kinds of philosophies to try and like not make myself suffer as much physically. And sometimes I would succeed. I would like forget my physical suffering for a while. And it would be incredibly joyous, like I experienced true joy. You know, meanwhile, emotionally, you know, you can have very good days where you're thinking very positively, everything seems very good, and then you have some kind of a relapse where you're just convinced that everything is horrible, you know, your life's going down the toilet and you're not going anywhere. And the worst thing about that is that you then also can very easily be seduced into thinking that just the other day when you were thinking so positively about life, you were deluding yourself. And you actually negate something that happened in the past. Whereas opposed to pain, you know, if I wasn't suffering, I simply was not suffering. Whereas the complexity of emotional suffering is that even when you're not suffering, you can believe that you're suffering. And it was almost like a testing ground. Like I was able to find out through, like when I was very sick with the chemotherapy, I would be ill and ill and ill for days and days. And then there would be this brief moment where I would know that I was going to get better. And I would feel this profound joy. And then in the next moment, I would feel very ill again, but that illness was somehow different. It was not necessarily lesser than the illness I had been feeling before that moment when I knew I would get well, but it was a physical feeling that was suffused with this knowledge that it was an impermanent state. And I had enough time to lie around and think and realize that it was this knowledge which changed the way I suffered, which alleviated my suffering, and it was a knowledge that had to do with just simply moving forward into the next moment and being very honest and not dragging my fear of suffering, because it's the fear of suffering which we suffer from far more than actual physical ailments themselves. And I transferred that onto sort of the emotional plane, and I realized that a lot of my emotional suffering came about from fearing, like sort of taking fears that were accrued in the past and projecting them into the future, like an unforeseen future.
Lucy Grayley speaking with Terry Gross in 1994. Her memoir is Autobiography of a Face. Lucy Grayley died last month. She was 39.